Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 107. This week's questions are taken from the video on the Imperial Japanese Navy's battlecruiser Kongo and its class, Guide 174, as well as the revoiced USS Clemson, USS Stuart, Northampton class and USS Northampton videos. So, let us begin. Snazzy Crowd 1212 asks a fairly long question, but basically, why do I hold the Kongo class in relative disdain in World War II when they seem to have been fairly useful? Well, a lot of their apparent usefulness to the Japanese Navy comes from the fact that they were used, period. When you look at most of the Japanese Navy's operations, you'll usually find a Kongo class or two floating around in there somewhere, whereas the Fusos, Isseis, Nagatos and even the Yamatos, to greater or lesser extents, didn't really actually do all that much. Especially the Fuso, Issei and Nagato classes. Yamato and Musashi did actually occasionally do things beyond get sunk, but the Kongos were the ones they were using the most, so that gives perhaps an artificial idea of how useful they were, simply because they were actually doing things. Now, fair enough, their speed was one of the reasons they were being used, so there is that. But the main reason I really don't rate the Kongos in World War II is because of what they did with the refits. They chose to up the speed of the ships in their refits in order to, in theory, keep up with the carriers as escorts. Okay, fine. I can understand that to a certain amount. But then in the end, when you think about, well, what are the Kongos most famous for? None of those actions involve escorting carriers. They're all completely independent actions. And the Japanese insisted on reclassifying them as fast battleships without upgrading the armour. And as I've said before, the armour is basically around about the same level, maybe, depending on exactly where on which frame you're at, slightly better or slightly worse than the average British Lion-class battlecruiser in World War I, sorry. And nobody really says that those were fast battleships. I mean, there's argument over whether or not Hood was or wasn't a fast battleship, and Hood actually has battleship-grade armour, at least where the belt is at its thickest. Kongo doesn't. So they're fast, yes, but battlecruisers are fast. They have an 8-gun battleship-grade armament, so do battlecruisers. They have battlecruiser-grade armour, therefore they're just battlecruisers you've made faster. The problem is the Japanese tried to use them as battleships, and that's how they ended up getting killed. Now, okay, fair enough. Kirishima versus South Dakota and Washington at the range that Washington was at when it opened fire, even if they'd chosen to forego the massive speed upgrade and maybe only push them to 29-30 knots and instead use some of that weight to increase the armour thickness, it's still not going to save Kirishima. But Hiei was effectively crippled and left for dead by 8-inch cruiser gunfire because its armour was not really all that great. If it had been upgraded to a sort of 29-30 knot vessel and it had its armour ramped up to 11 or 12 inches, Hiei probably would have come out of that fight in a lot better condition than it actually did. And yes, in some of those roles, their speed did come in handy. So, like with the night raids in Guadalcanal, they were moving in at speed and then moving out again at speed. But again, they weren't usually running full pelt. So, again, if they'd restricted the engine upgrades to a point that the ship could do 29-30 knots and put a bit more armour in, then they probably would have been a lot more survivable and a lot more useful. And I know their top speed after upgrades was sort of 31-ish knots, but at the speeds you're talking about, 29 to 31 knots is actually an awful lot of power extra that you have to put into the ship, especially given that obviously their hulls weren't designed for that speed initially, which is why they had to do various modifications and extensions. So it's, yeah, they still would have saved a fair bit if they'd accepted a 29 knot top speed over a 30.5, 31 knot top speed. And the other two things to bear in mind is, one, They're designed to operate with the carriers. As I said, they didn't really do that all that often. They did occasionally, but not all the time. And secondly, if you are the Japanese and you're planning for your carrier ops, you've got to bear in mind that you still have ships like Kaga, which are not capable of even 29-30 knots. So, again, pushing that speed high, okay, if you're planning to escort only your modern fast carriers, there's a certain amount to be said there, but even then, the modern fast Japanese carriers like Shikaku, Zuikaku, etc., are faster still than the Kongo refits, so they're still not going to be able to keep up, even with their around about 31 knot top speed, if the carriers go absolutely flank. So it would make a lot more sense to me to have just said, okay, you know what, we're going to cap it, let's say 29 knots, and we're going to stick another 2-3 inches of armour on, and we're going to actually focus around making them decentish, sort of light battleships. Alwyn Bin asks, you mentioned that the Kongo's refit design varies from ship to ship. Was this due to Imperial Japanese Navy testing various designs, or them not having a standard design in mind during the refits? Well, as was mentioned in the video, one of the ships was used to kind of prototype some of the ideas for the bridge tower that was going to be used in the Yamato class, so there's certainly a certain amount of testing various designs out going on there. But to be perfectly honest, a lot of it was just due to the absolutely rapid advance of naval technology at the time. Bear in mind, everything had been in a kind of static phase as far as capital ship design was construction was concerned for about a decade plus. In the interwar period, everyone had had these great ideas for the early 1920s for the ships that were counselled by Washington, and then, apart from various weird and wonderful paper designs, hadn't really got anything practical done during the 20s beyond the occasional refit and minor modernisation. When it got to the 30s and everyone was now refitting, modernising and their old ships and designing new ones, it was kind of almost like a valve had been opened and lots of technological advances that had been burbling away in the background were now being put into place. And naval technology, to a certain degree, does seem to work in this fits and starts motion, where you'll have periods of iterative design and then you'll have other periods, and bear in mind when you're talking about naval technology, these periods can last for decades, where suddenly there's a massive acceleration in naval technology and everything is on the table to be modified, changed, etc., and new stuff coming through. And you see this with the other modernizations that go on. If you look at the Italian modernizations, which, to be perfectly honest, are probably about the closest you get to some vague kind of homogeneity, but even they're massive refits of their World War I era dreadnoughts still have some differences between them. The Royal Navy, when they're refitting and modernising their newer ships, there is a fairly marked difference. There's a certain family resemblance between, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant are almost the same. Renown is very definitely similar to what they did to Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, but Warspite is also modernised, but it is very different to the other three. And the same thing with some of the US Navy work, although they didn't go in for the full modernizations on the same level that Kongo or the Italians or the Queen Elizabeth had. They did do some degree of modernization on some of the old standards, and that varies. If you look at the various modernizations, to be fair, with the US Navy, it's mostly wartime, when they're updating, say, ships that survive Pearl Harbor as opposed to ships that are refitted completely after being salvaged at Pearl Harbor. There's a whole slew of differences even within ships of the same class, again because of partially budget constraints at various points, but partially because, well, the opportunity and the technology that's available at the time. So yeah, they might have started off with the first refit or two with an idea of, right, this is what we can do in terms of technology and budget, but by the time you progress, bearing in mind that each of these refits in modernizations takes years, technology has moved on to a point where you're like, well, actually, we could do that, but now the technology suggests we should do this. And so over the course of half a decade to a decade, you end up with modernizations of ships of ostensibly the same class coming out looking somewhat different, depending on the ship in question. Gottjäger asks, why was HMS Royal George of 1788 broken up in 1822? Worn out, surplus, obsolescent? If she'd been raséed, what would her state have likely been? Would there have been anything like her afloat elsewhere? It might seem indeed odd that Royal George, which was a 100-gun first rate, fractionally larger than HMS Victory, would be broken up after what would apparently seem to be a mere 30 or so years of service. But there were a few reasons for that. One of which was that after 20 to 30 years of service, most large age of sail wooden warships needed what we would classify today as a refit, but back then was usually called a large repair. Occasionally, if they were in pretty good condition, they might have a middling repair, but either way. And this cost money and resources to do. Now, obviously, Victory, which is a somewhat older vessel, had already gone through a couple of those by this point. But when it came to the 1820s, there was one other factor, and that was what's on screen at the moment, the Caledonia class. Now, the Caledonia class took HMS Victory's general form as its starting point and enlarged that to a 120-gun first-rate ship of the line. So, obviously, considerably more firepower than your regular 100-gunner. And it's notable, of course, that Caledonia followed on Victory's plans and not the somewhat later Royal George and its sister ship Queen Charlotte's plans, because Victory was just that good a design. And so with the Royal Navy building new first rates of the Caledonia class, when it came to making a large repair on the Royal George, it was a case of, well, why? The large repairs cost almost as much as building a new ship in some ways. It was just a little bit quicker, apart from anything else. But they had this Caledonia class program going on. The Caledonia class was much more heavily armed, much larger, and of course it would be a new ship. So, faced with that choice and the fact that in peacetime the Royal Navy couldn't really afford to go, well, let's do both, which is what they probably would have done if the Napoleonic Wars had still been going on, they took the choice to get rid of the old Royal George and instead spend the money on making another Caledonia class, which was named Royal George and replaced Royal George in service. Now, as far as a Rasé version of her, well, that would have been out of the question basically on the grounds that the Royal Navy didn't need Rasé-type heavy frigates at the time. They had their own heavy frigate building program, and again, a new ship that was projected to last a very long time in peace would have been better than an older ship that would have more maintenance requirements and didn't necessarily reflect the latest developments in ship construction. However, if that had happened, her overall number of guns wouldn't have been that much greater than a typical Rasé, because you've got to remember the main difference between something like HMS Majestic, which was Raséed and showed up at the latter part of the War of 1812, as previously having been a 74-gunner, and something like Royal George, isn't so much the length, Royal George being 190 foot long on the gun deck, and Majestic only being about 20 foot shorter, but it's more to do with that third gun deck. A third rate will have two full gun decks, and then the quarter deck and forecastle will have some additional guns, whereas a first rate, will have three full gun decks and then a quarter deck and forecastle. So that's where the extra firepower tends to come from, and also will tend to carry heavier guns. So overall, probably would have still been around a mid to high 50s gun Rasé. Where it would have made the biggest difference, however, would have been in the sheer firepower of that, because Majestic, once it was refitted, carried a mixture of heavy carronades and 32-pounder cannon, and in its previous form as a third rate, it carried 32-pounder and 18-pounder guns on its main gun decks, whereas Royal George, by this point in the 1820s, would have been carrying 32-pounders on the lower gun deck, but 24-pounders on the middle gun deck, and then lighter weapons higher up. So if it had been raséed, and if they'd taken off the entire upper gun deck as well, obviously in the rasé process, you would have ended up with probably a lower gun deck full of 32-pounders and a middle gun deck full of 24-pounders, and then whatever you wanted to have on the quarterdeck and forecastle, which probably would have been a series of heavy carronades, maybe either 42 or 68-pounder carronades. That would have been quite the vicious broadside, because you'd be looking at a, well, formerly middle deck, now upper gun deck, broadside that's basically comparable to the main gun deck broadside of something like USS Constitution, plus an additional gun deck's worth of 32-pounders, which are even heavier, and then whatever carronades they choose to stick on top of that. And of course, the hull is built as a 100-gun first-rate ship of the line, so it's very, very heavy. It would have made an absolutely ferocious rasé frigate, but it would have been one heck of a maintenance hog, I suspect, which is probably one of the reasons why it wasn't raséed, even though it would have been quite amusing to see. Dan Darling asks, you mentioned the earliest version of Kongo had submerged torpedo tubes. I assume that means the tubes are physically under the waterline. And how does this work? Are the tubes just fixed in place, like submarine tubes, or is there some kind of pivot? If they're fixed, does that mean the tubes only fire in one arc, or that gyro angles can be set before firing? And if you can set the angles, is there a time during a combat situation to do so? Finally, if there is a pivot ability, how do they keep the area watertight? Generally speaking, the submerged torpedo tubes on battleships were fixed. They weren't pivoted. But there were obviously issues about firing because, well, you can't really stop a battleship in the middle of an engagement to fire your torpedo. And if you're moving, that means there's going to be a very high velocity stream of water coming past the hull, which is obviously going to, well, at best knock a torpedo off course, at worst tear it apart as it emerges from the tube, especially if they are side-mounted torpedo launchers. So how does one fix this? And obviously, as you mentioned, there's also the small fact of you can't really afford to turn an entire battleship just to point your torpedoes. So firstly, when the torpedo is being launched, it would have a gyro set to correct the angle to where you wanted it to go. And that's why most battleships that had torpedoes fitted would also have a torpedo fire control station somewhere further up in the ship. And that would transmit down to the torpedo room what their angle they needed to set their gyros to relative to obviously the ship's bearing and the torpedo tube's bearing. Now, once you've taken that into account, you also have to, as I say, deal with the water flow issue, and that's where this little contraption that is being shown comes in. The exact shape, manner, etc. varied depending on the ship in question. This particular one, as you can see, is labelled, but this is a torpedo launcher rail. And the idea of this is that this would be extended out into the water flow around the hull of the ship, as you can see, before the torpedo is fired. And this would not only break up the water flow somewhat, it would also shield the torpedo somewhat from the sort of sheath of water that was flowing past the battleship. And the torpedo would actually run along it. You can see the actual rail part of it there on the facing side. So when the torpedo was launched, it would travel along this rail, and that would protect it from the water flow immediately in contact with the hull until obviously the whole of the torpedo has emerged from the ship, and hopefully it's transitioned past the most turbulent part of the water flow into normal water, and then it can obviously make the relevant turn as set by the gyros and motor on towards its target. So there were quite a bit of different bits of technology and thinking going into this particular little outfit of technology, and of course, outside of Rodney torpedoing Bismarck, it never actually achieved all that much, so perhaps it was a little bit of a wasted effort, but it certainly was an evidence of quite ingenious problem solving. Josh Thomas Moore asks, what would happen if the Japanese sent the Fusos or the Issei instead of Hiei and Kirishima during the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal? Well, firstly, it's somewhat doubtful they'd actually get there in time. As I said earlier in one of the first questions, the one advantage that the Kongos had was their speed, and whilst the Fusos and the Isseis are not monolithically slow, they're still quite a considerable bit slower than the Kongos, so it's possible they might not even have made it into the engagement zone in time, given that the Japanese were running in at night for good reason. However, assuming that they somehow do so, maybe they just go full bore on the engines. Maybe the Japanese have refitted them with better quality engines before the war in this alternate scenario. For whatever it is, anyway, they're there. Going in instead of Hiei probably actually do considerably better, because, well, they are actually armoured to resist 8-inch shell fire at ranges that are somewhat closer, so probably not going to get shot to pieces quite the same way as Hiei. And of course, 2 extra gun turrets doesn't hurt, so in that kind of melee, you're probably going to be dishing out a lot more damage as well. So overall, assuming she gets there on time, Fuso or Issei would do better than Hiei, I think. As far as Kirishima goes, now this is the interesting one, because of course Washington, which has been gracing our screens, will still quite happily put down a Fuso or an Issei because, well, 16-inch guns at that kind of point-blank range. The armour is basically there to activate the shell's fuse, and that's about it. With that said, Fuso or Issei, or I guess if Fuso or Issei are going to, instead of Hiei, then it would be Yamashiro or Hyuga, but whatever the case, they are going to have a slightly more extensive secondary battery, and again, 2 extra gun turrets, 4 extra guns. There's probably a reasonable chance of them doing some more appreciable damage to South Dakota, even by pure weight of fire, if nothing else. And also, again, being somewhat heavier ships, they might last against Washington's gunfire not a massively greater amount of time, but slightly longer than Kirishima, which, again, slightly extended engagement time, plus more guns, more chance to actually get a 14-inch AP on target, and do some more damage to South Dakota. But that's very much a roll of the dice thing. The one thing you can guarantee is that it's not coming back once Washington sneaks up on it. So, overall, in Scenario 1 with Hiei, definite improvement. In Scenario 2, mild improvement, possibly a lot of improvement, depending on the kind of hits they land on South Dakota, but not changing the overall outcome all that much. Joe Blow and a number of others ask, which action movie was USS Moody, the Clemson-class destroyer, sold to MGM Studios to be blown to pieces for? It was the movie Hell Below from 1933, which is very difficult to actually find because there are a number of movies called Hell Below, including another one that was done in 1933, which doesn't help. But here you go. This is the film footage in question in glorious 240p. The ship was modified to resemble a German destroyer, and it was ostensibly being sunk by a US submarine in the film. And yeah, they set a bunch of charges in it to look like a torpedo explosion and blew the ship in two, which you've got to admit is one heck of an awesome practical effect. They are literally sinking a ship here, albeit that it doesn't mean you've got to make very, very certain that everything goes right the first time, because just watching this, I really, really doubt that there was any room for a take two if someone had decided they wanted something else. Next up, the French Navy has decided they don't want the British to have all the fun in World War I and want to follow the path of their forefathers and donate ships to the Royal Navy to make a French 6th Battle Squadron. What ships would be best, and would you choose if you had the option, if there are any differences between the best and your own preference? This is actually a really, really difficult one, because, well, there are only two classes of French battleship, dreadnought battleship in service at this point, the Corbeil and Bretagne classes, and to be perfectly honest, I really wouldn't want to take either of them. But if I'm forced to, there is no easy choice, and the reason I say that is both of them have extremely limited ranges on their main guns, because the French at this point were still of the belief that battle would be fought at well under 10,000 yards, And so neither ship can actually range out to the kind of ranges that the Battle of Jutland was certainly started at, and for a lot of the battles actually fought at. The Corbett's are worse in that respect than the Britannias, and of course they carry lighter guns. So you might think, well, if the Britannias are longer range and they have heavier firepower, surely you'd want to take them. Kind of. But the Britannias are slower than the Corbett's. The Corbett's were designed for 21 knots, and they actually, depending on the ship, well, they all exceeded 21 knots, but by how much depends ship to ship. The problem with the Britannias is that they only ever made about 20 knots on a good day, which means that my standard squadron battle speed in the Grand Fleet of 21 knots is going to be slowed down by taking the Britannias, and as we learned in the two videos about Jutland so far, speed was one of Jellicoe's advantages. Sacrificing some of that is not necessarily a good idea. The thing is, if I take the Corbett's, they can keep up, sure, and if anyone gets to sort of the low tens of thousands of yards, sure, they can fire on things and kill things and whatever. Their guns aren't too awful once they're actually in firing range. But realistically, for the majority of the battle, they're not going to contribute all that much other than being fire magnets. Whereas with the Britannias, okay, they're still not got fantastic range, but they can contribute for something more of the battle, and their guns will hit a lot harder. But again, do I want to slow the entire fleet down, even if it is by a knot or knot and a half, in order to accommodate this? Bearing in mind how close run of things some of the deployments were at Jutland. Yeah, difficult. The only thing that would tip the balance towards the Britannias would be me personally, as opposed to me in the role of Admiral Jellicoe, exercising the wonderful power of 2020 hindsight and realising that if I take the Britannias, not only do I have slightly more useful firepower, but by slightly slowing the fleet, although that might have some rather interesting and not so brilliant effects on deployment to face off against the high seas fleet, well, again, it might have a benefit, because by slowing me down fractionally, if everything else goes the same way it did, then I might deploy slightly earlier, which means I get a straighter line, which means when the high seas fleet runs into me, I get more concentration of fire on them in the opening salvos during the first engagement between the big fleets. And if the Britannias are in a position to open fire, then, well, their shells don't suffer from the same premature detonation issues as the Royal Navy's do, so they might actually do a fair chunk of damage. But perhaps more critically, during the night action, and this really is a kind of a throw the dice and see which way or other it comes up, but if I'm that fraction slower, even if it's only a knot slower in my cruising speed, because obviously cruising speed is relative to top speed, that in turn might mean that even with the various delays that the Germans have, they might end up running into the Grand Fleet rather than the rear destroyer lines. Now, that might be very, very good, or it might go horribly wrong, considering that the Germans had significantly better night fighting skills at that point. But it certainly would be interesting, to say the least. So, if I was going to play it safe, probably the Corbett's, but I like living dangerously to a certain degree, so let's go with the Britannias and see what happens. Gottjäger asks, if the London naval treaties hadn't been written, how would World War II be affected? How would ship construction in the 1930s differ from the original timeline, etc.? The effects would be quite considerable and widespread. Now, the Washington Naval Treaty did have an expiry date, so technically speaking, if those London Naval Treaties weren't made, everything would expire and everything would be all over the place. But let's, for the sake of argument, assume that people just agree to continue with the Washington Treaty limitations and they don't sign up to anything new like the London Naval Treaty. Well, at the top end of the scale, aircraft carriers and battleships, the loophole of an aircraft carrier being something over 10,000 tons still exists. So you might see further attempts to exploit that loophole with things like Ryuho, the honestly, we are really 10,000 tons of aircraft carrier governor type vessel. And once that starts, I think a lot of the other nations are going to start copying that. Also, in terms of capital ships, they're still limited to 35,000 tons, but their gun caliber is now 16 inches. So instead of King George V, you're probably going to see something more like Lion. And you're probably going to see... You're probably actually not going to see USS North Carolina at all, because that was designed for 14-inch guns. You're probably going to see something maybe not exactly like, but more close to USS South Dakota coming into play instead. Cruisers, meanwhile, are limited to 10,000 tons, but just a maximum gun caliber of 8 inches. So without that artificial distinction between the heavy and the light cruiser, you're probably going to see a lot more cruisers armed with 8-inch guns, and there will still be 6-inch cruisers for rapid fire capability and for smaller capabilities for commerce protection and stuff. But whether or not you would see the large light cruisers that are all sort of 10,000 tonners alongside the 8-inch cruisers, I'm not so certain. I think people will probably just build more 8-inch cruisers. It would really depend on if the quick-firing 6-inch gun technology advances at the same rate that it did under the pressures from the London naval treaties, and whether any navies are willing to take the jump and trust that 6-inch guns' rate of fire and numbers could make up for the deficiency of firepower individually against the 8-inch gun. And you wouldn't also get things like the Megamis, because there'd be no reason to pretend that the Megamis are light cruisers. You just build them with 8-inch guns directly. Submarines would probably be a lot bigger, because remember, a bunch of different nations were trying to build large submarine cruisers to, again, get around loopholes in the Washington Treaty. That loophole, like the aircraft carriers under 10,000 ton limit, was closed off by the London naval treaties. So without that loophole being closed off, submarine cruisers are probably still going to be around. They're not the world's best idea, to be perfectly honest, but you probably still see more of them. And lastly, of course, the London Treaty brought in restrictions on destroyer displacement and firepower. Now, okay, the limitation on firepower for guns not exceeding 5.1 inches, that's probably more of just a paperwork thing. There probably will be someone, let's face it, who'll be stupid enough to try and mount an even larger gun on a destroyer, but destroyers, their gun size is more limited by their overall size displacement and the need for rapid fire. So I don't think that much is going to affect the destroyers, but what will be quite significantly affected is size, because you look at things like the Fubukis, etc., that's where destroyer design was going in the late 20s, and some of the larger French destroyers as well. Then everything got the knees cut out from under it by the 1850-ton maximum displacement limit, and then later also the smaller displacement limit for the bulk of destroyers. If those aren't in place, then I suspect the growth of destroyers to the sort of 2,500 ton displacement limit, which you kind of see with things like the Fletchers and the Gearings and the Battles and the Darings, etc., etc., that's probably actually going to be reached in the early 30s. So by the time you get to World War II, I think it probably would stabilise, because once you start to get above about maybe 2,500, 3,000 tons, A, destroyers start to get quite expensive, so you can't afford the numbers, and B, they start to approach small light cruiser size. So they start to lose some of their utility. But it would probably mean that World War II would be fought by fairly large numbers of destroyers in that upper size bracket of the kind that you wouldn't see that many of until right at the end of World War II historically. So there's quite a lot of changes there, and that's just the easy surface changes from the various limitations that were imposed additionally by the London treaties as opposed to the Washington Treaty. So yeah, it'd be a very interesting alternate scenario. And this, of course, is assuming that everyone just signs a continuation for the Washington Treaty. That's not even considering what would happen if they just let it lapse and the 1930s were a free-for-all. Daniel Sherwater asks, in other videos on YouTube, they mentioned that the Royal Navy didn't prepare that well for the U-boats in World War II and was in fact quite vulnerable to them. Is this true, and if so, how did this come to be? The U-boat campaign of World War I must have been known about, so did they ignore this or miscalculate? It was a mixture of things. The Royal Navy was certainly very well prepared for a U-boat campaign as they understood it. That in some ways married up with reality, and in other ways really didn't. So they understood that the U-boat threat would be quite severe. So unlike World War I, they were ready to go into convoy duty immediately rather than several years in. They also had worked quite heavily on various methods to counter submarines, so improved depth charges. Of course, they were also working on the technology that would eventually lead to things like Hedgehog and Squid, those being the anti-submarine weapons. They'd also worked incredibly hard on hydrophones and ASDIC, or what we now call sonar. So in all those respects, and also in terms of aerial search and recon for attacking submarines, that had all been done. So they'd put a lot of thought and preparation into how to deal with U-boats. They were also planning on building a lot of escorts, like the Flower class and such. Now, fair enough, that was a little bit of a crash program, but at the same time, they were preparing to have that crash program put into place. It's just that in the 20s and 30s, with the limitations on the budget, they could either afford to maintain the battle fleet or build a massive fleet of escorts, but not both. So they maintained the battle fleet because you can build a fleet of escorts a lot more quickly. So those are all the positives. The negatives are that, well, they were slightly slower off the mark in building the massive fleet of escorts than they otherwise wanted to be, because again, they were still trying to build up the battle fleet. And so for the first few years of the U-boat campaign, they were in some issues with shortages of escorts. Secondly, there was still the fact that, well, they'd only just got the Fleet Air Arm back off the RAF, and Coastal Command was still under the control of the RAF, so there was a little bit of an issue in, getting aircraft at all, and then getting capable aircraft in order to do things like anti-submarine patrols. There was also the fact that they were perhaps a bit too optimistic about how well ASDIC would perform. They kind of had a few good tests and decided that, okay, well, now that we have ASDIC or active sonar, therefore the submarine menace is defeated because we can just turn this on and it'll go ping, ping, ping. We'll see the submarines coming and then we can kill them and happy days. Yeah, it turned out while ASDIC was very good at finding and detecting submarines and helping to attack them, much better than the old visual recognition only methods of World War I. One, it didn't work against submarines that were on the surface or at periscope depth, and two, it wasn't anywhere near as effective as exercises suggested it would be. So they thought, well, if you have 3 or 4 escorts with ASDIC, then effectively you've got this force field of detection where you can see a submarine coming. It didn't quite turn out that way. So perhaps a degree of overconfidence in their equipment. And finally, there was also an underappreciation of just how lethal submarines could be to modern warships. Again, partly based on exercises, partly actually based on wartime experience, because when you'd had submarines in World War I, one of the best counters to them, if you were a warship, was simply to proceed at speed. And it was very unlikely the submarine would be in a position to actually attack you, and it wouldn't be fast enough to reposition itself to get into an intercept point. So the theory went that, well, if that was the case when warships generally, at least in terms of capital ships, had a top speed of 20, 21, 23 knots, outside of battle cruisers and the Queen Elizabeths, then surely now that carriers and the latest battleships had speeds in the high 20s and low 30s of knots, well, submarines would find it very, very difficult to attack them if they could at all. And again, escorts with ASDIC and such like should render them pretty much immune. That didn't quite work out. I mean, the defences of Scapa Flow obviously were pierced by U-47, and a number of ships took torpedo hits, capital ships. A number of other ships had very lucky escapes from torpedoes. And of course, with this whole conception of exactly how capable submarines actually were, which was a little bit off, it meant that when they thought that they could go hunting for enemy submarines using fleet carriers rather than get the subs to come to a target. They thought, oh, no, we'll send out hunter groups. And well, the idea in theory made sense, because a fleet carrier like Courageous could carry lots and lots of aircraft. It could deploy them over a very large area. And so in theory, if you had this ring of ASDIC-equipped escorts who could see a submarine that might happen perchance to sneak up on the fast carrier by some miracle, well, they'll be able to detect it. And with this massive range of visual sighting and attack, the aircraft should be able to mow through submarines like there's no tomorrow. As it turned out for Courageous, that was not exactly the case, and it got torpedoed and sunk very early, which was not ideal. So, yeah. There were vulnerabilities for the Royal Navy in terms of the U-boat campaign in World War II, but it didn't really stem from not preparing well or not preparing at all. It stemmed from the fact that the Royal Navy made extensive preparations, but some of those preparations were based on faulty information, and some of those preparations were based on an overconfidence in the ability of new technology, which, to be fair, is just another kind of false information. So it's not exactly like the Royal Navy was alone in that particular little conundrum. And so on to our selection of Patreon questions. Matt Blom asks, did the Italian practice of boring out warship guns to increase their shell caliber cause any noticeable accidents or issues with the guns? I'm not aware of any specific incidents or big accidents that occurred with the rebored 12.6-inch guns, specifically as a result of their reboring. There were some issues with the guns. Now, obviously, a gun is built for the caliber that it was designed at, and if you bore for it out, you are lessening the strength of the gun. So that makes it more vulnerable to a number of things. As I say, bursting doesn't appear to have been one of them, with, well, let's face it, taking 0.3 of an inch off of either side. It's not the end of the world, but they did reportedly have some problems with dispersion. Not massive ones, but basically the guns were less accurate once they had been rebored to 12.6 inches as compared to when they were just 12-inch guns. And that's not in terms of, well, they'll go hilariously all over the place, but that dispersion circle where you expect the shells to land was somewhat larger. And obviously, any gun droops somewhat. The more and more you fire it, the more and more it heats up. If you remove material, then it's going to droop more because it has less strength and it has less thermal mass. So there were issues with that as well, which obviously affects the dispersion as well. Now, the dispersion, more than anything else, would have likely been, again, because you've taken off material, the gun is going to whip slightly more. And so that's going to throw everything out a little bit more. So yeah, there were a few minor sacrifices to be made, but overall, that was actually quite a successful reboring project to give them a slight edge in firepower as compared to what they had originally. Matt Kidd asks, was the mutiny on the Bounty good for William Bligh's career? It seems like how he was viewed contemporaneously must have been very different from the mutiny's portrayal in modern films and culture, given his career trajectory after the mutiny. Yes, much as it might be a little bit of naval mythology smashing, Captain Bligh was not a random, completely authoritarian tyrant who liked to whip men to death for no particular reason, as is portrayed in a lot of films. Basically, that's how he was portrayed by the mutineers, but shockingly, given that the mutineers faced hanging if they were caught, and indeed some of them were, they had, shall we say, a vested interest in justifying their actions to the hilt, whereas the other parties, the ones who stayed loyal to Bligh and those who were somewhat neutral in the fact, as well as actually some of the mutineers, testified that that wasn't actually true. If anything, Bligh was slightly more lenient with his men than the average Royal Navy captain, believe it or not. He did have his faults. He could hold a grudge like a dwarf with a bad headache. And once he was fixated that you were at fault, you were not going to get anything other than short shrift from him for a long, long time to come, even if he was wrong. And that, perhaps, if anything, outside of selfishness, was the main cause of the mutiny. Because, yeah, holding grudges when you're on a small ship like the Bounty is not really a good way to endear yourself to the crew. There's a whole range of options that presented for why the mutiny on the Bounty happened, but it's not really the time and place to go into them here. Now, as Matt Kidd mentions, the mutiny on the Bounty, I wouldn't say it was necessarily good for his career. It didn't seem to overall hurt his career because he was acquitted at the court-martial, and once he was acquitted of any major wrongdoing, pretty much all the ire about it turned on the mutineers themselves. And the thing is, Bligh was actually a pretty good sailor. I mean, the fact that he was set adrift in a launch and managed to keep the launch crew both together and coherent enough to actually make it their way to safety in and of itself is a remarkable feat of seamanship. But it must also be remembered he went on to active combat command in the Royal Navy. He was present at the Battle of Camperdown and at the Battle of Copenhagen, the first one, under Nelson. Both times he acquitted himself very well, with minimal casualties to his own ship. In the Camperdown case, actually capturing Dutch vessels, and in the Battle of Copenhagen, he actually deliberately sided with Nelson by repeating Nelson's signal and not Parker's signal. So, yeah, he was actually pretty good, all things considered, Royal Navy combat captain. But, yeah, when he was left in charge of disciplinary issues, he didn't tend to make the best job of it, shall we say, in some of his later career postings as well. But that was, as I say, because of various personal faults that weren't actually related to this idea that he would just flog you on sight. Emerald Leafeon asks, I know the Iowas were considered for a conversion to missile battleships, and I believe you mentioned the Alaskas were under consideration for similar treatment. Were there any other ships in the US or other countries' history that were under the same consideration? Yes, at one point or another, virtually every nation that had large capital ships left after World War II, such as battleships or battlecruisers, pretty much entertained the idea of converting one or more of them to guided missile standards. Most of them were abandoned for pretty much the same reasons that the Iowa and Alaska class conversions were abandoned. But there were also ideas about converting smaller ships to guided missile ships. Now, the thing was, whilst there was some idea of putting missiles on World War II era destroyers, and indeed much, much later down the line, when they were near the end of their operational lives, very few of them actually did receive it. For the majority of the time in the early missile age, 50s and so forth, the missile systems were just too big. It was just not worth it, and you couldn't basically fit them on, let alone anything else. And so where the conversions came in sort of lower down the line from capital ships was cruisers. So in the US, the Baltimores and their successors, the Oregon Cities, and some of the Clevelands as well, various members of those classes were converted into various basically renamed classes that had guided missile installations installed on them. So those were actually done. And similarly, in a number of other navies, some of the World War II era cruisers were converted to carry one or more guided missile systems. And that's basically because, as we've said in other places, the cruisers were not too far off the size of battleships in some cases. I mean, some of the late war era cruisers were actually larger than some of the World War I battleships in terms of dimensions, if not displacement, because obviously they weren't anywhere near as heavily armed or armoured. And so they had a fair amount of hull volume for these kinds of conversions. Now, exactly how far along that conversion went depended on the time, with obviously the missile system in question. If you're going to try and fit something like Terrier or Talos on board, you're going to get fewer missiles and launchers than if you are looking at, say, a relatively unconverted World War II hull and you're thinking about converting it in the 70s or 80s. Or the 80s might be a bit late. But also in terms of the expense in doing so. So obviously the US Navy had a fair bit more money than most, so it could afford to do sort of full-scale conversions, and other navies, perhaps with less funding, they could look at putting some missiles aboard, but not a full-scale conversion. And this is, amongst other reasons, why a number of medium and short-range missile systems that were developed in the 50s, 60s, or at least thought of at that time, were looking at effectively, can we make something which we can use to replace secondary battery guns and or 40mm installations, sort of bolt-on, bolt-off type things, because that's a lot cheaper than trying to work with something that you have to do a complete depth refit for. Darren Liu asks, I grew up in Penang, and one piece of local trivia that has intrigued me was the existence of German U-boats operating out of Penang port. Do you have any details about the Monson boats, and did they actually achieve anything of significance? So, yes, there was a group of U-boats and the occasional Italian submarine that operated out of Penang, which is an area in, well, at the time, Malaya, I believe now is Malaysia. And once that had been occupied by the Japanese, it was held to be a port that potentially the Germans and Italians could operate submarines out of to attack Indian Ocean convoys, which were very important to the Allies, and generally sailed mostly with anti-surface escorts, because it was thought surface raiders would be more of a threat there, although they did have some anti-submarine assets as well. In terms of achieving anything of significance, not greatly in terms of sinking enemy shipping, mainly because getting to and from there from Europe was actually surprisingly hazardous. The list of U-boats and Italian subs, as well as the odd Japanese sub, that tried to make that journey and ends with sunk by RAF aircraft, sunk by Royal Navy aircraft, sunk by Royal Navy submarine hunters, torpedoed by Royal Navy submarine, or in some other way sunk, usually hitting a mine or occasionally running into a US vessel or Royal Australian vessel. That accounts for the vast majority of them. Very relatively few of the ships that actually, or boats I should say, that actually set out for Penang actually got there, and of the ones that actually got there, not that many of them had a massively long and successful career. There were a few still around by the time Germany surrendered and Japan briefly took over what was left, but as a return on investment for the Axis, it probably wasn't the best. They probably could have, in both sides, made a lot more use of those submarines just operating in their normal environments. They did manage to do a number of interesting cargo runs, so I guess in terms of significance, that's probably actually more notable in transporting war materials, plans, etc. And perhaps also the great missed opportunity, which at some point should get a video of its own, the Japanese submarine I-30. A few months into the Pacific War, it's carrying German torpedoes and torpedo blueprints, German torpedo targeting computers, it's carrying radar, it's carrying hydrophones, it's carrying radar warning receivers, it's carrying Enigma machines, it's carrying sonar countermeasures, it's carrying all sorts of fancy things. Also, decent anti-aircraft guns. The Japanese, they really could have used a few of those. It's carrying all of these things, and actually makes the journey to Germany, picks them up, makes it all the way back, and then calls in to one of the occupied Japanese ports, doesn't offload anything because it's making its way back to Japan, hits a mine and sinks. So, late 42, potentially, not war-changing or war-winning, but certainly war-altering potential of all the stuff that was on board I-30. Gone when it hit a mine because they didn't even bother to offload or copy the plans, let alone anything else. So that was a really big missed opportunity, which, as I say, at some point we'll examine in more detail. Outside of that, and a few blueprints and other bits and pieces here and there that were taken to and from by other submarines, never quite in the same ambitious levels of amounts that I-30 was carrying. A few freighters sunk, a few targets for various American aircraft and British aircraft and shipping, etc. But yeah, unfortunately for them, and probably quite fortunately for the Allies, never anything of absolutely colossal significance. I mean, the fact that the Allies had decrypted a lot of the German coding and could predict when the German submarines were going to show up off Penang and have the correct hunter-killer groups waiting for them probably didn't help. William Tyson asks, are the R-Class underrated given their bad reputation compared to the Queen Elizabeths? To a certain extent, yes. I mean, The R-class were the smaller, cheaper, more conventional alternative to the Queen Elizabeths. Now, obviously, being slightly later, they did benefit from a few minor advances in technology. They, for example, had a slightly better armour layout than the Queen Elizabeths. But I think in terms of their underratedness, that probably covers how they're viewed in World War One. In World War One, they were exceptionally lethal battleships. The Germans certainly didn't have anything that could match them outside of Bayern and Baden. And, well, they had just the same kind of firepower as the Queen Elizabeths, as I say, slightly better armour than the Queen Elizabeths, and they were planned to be built in much larger numbers than the Queen Elizabeths. And, well, to be fair, they did, even with the pause in construction, they did give us renown and repulse, so we can always be grateful for that, albeit by proxy. Now, where their sort of perhaps underestimation comes from is from the transition from World War I to World War II. Because they were rated for, okay, fair enough, just slightly faster than the average World War I battle line, i.e. they were originally thought to be about 21 knots. They turned out to be 23 because they switched to pure oil firing, but they were slower than the Queen Elizabeths, and because they were designed to be slightly slower in the first place, they were also slightly smaller. And this meant that the Queen Elizabeths had, in the kind of overall margin when the Royal Navy was making its calculations for refits and modernisations, the Queen Elizabeths had a slight speed advantage. It was only fair enough, 1 or 2 knots as designed, but that's something. And also, just by dint of being larger, there was more room to put more systems without affecting stability quite as much on the Queen Elizabeths. And that meant the Queen Elizabeth got the refits, they got the modernisations, therefore their engines were kept in better shape, and they kind of roughly, within a knot or two, stayed at their original design speeds. The R's, because they didn't get the same level of attention, their speed dropped and dropped until in the mid to latter part of World War II, the R's that were still in service were probably lucky to hit 19 or 20 knots on a good day. And so this kind of limited their roles. They were more often used for convoy escorts. They were kind of second string units to back up the first string units in the Mediterranean and in the Indian Ocean. And really, unfortunately, I mean, apart from obviously my personal connection with the sinking of Royal Oak was the most modernised and the R that was in the best condition of the class. So the fact that it went down so early, I'm not necessarily saying that Royal Oak would have matched something like Queen Elizabeth Valiant or Warspite, but Royal Oak certainly could have been as useful, or possibly even slightly more so, than something like Barham or Malaya, and certainly a lot more useful than the majority of the rest of the R's, but let's say that didn't happen because of U-47. And of course, without that modernisation also meant they couldn't have high elevation on their guns, at least for a while, so they had to use superchargers, which kind of swings and roundabouts. But yeah, the fact that they were designed for that lower speed meant that without something really massive like a Kongo style modernisation, they were never going to get particularly faster. They weren't quite as open for expansion, and so they weren't going to be as capable as the Queen Elizabeths in a World War II level environment, even if the Royal Navy had infinite money and the ability to refit everything. I think they certainly do get a bit of a short shrift, because a lot of people do tend to dismiss them outright as completely useless. They weren't completely useless. They did have a role to play. They did, as I back up ships like Warspite in the Mediterranean. And a 15-inch 42 is still a 15-inch 42. These ships have 8 of them. If you get within range, they're going to hurt you. There's a reason that when ships like Scharnhorst and Gneisenau saw these kinds of vessels in convoy escorts, they just looked at them and went, nope. Because in that kind of scenario, the fact they were slower didn't matter too much, because the Scharnhorst had to come to them and not the other way around. It would have been nice to see a fully modernised R and see what it could have done, but oh well. And finally for today, Glenn Ricafrente asks, did US Navy and Royal Navy anti-aircraft fire become good enough toward the end of the war to nullify or significantly diminish the effectiveness of carrier airstrikes? We'll put it this way, if the two carrier forces with the same late war Allied AA capabilities faced off, would their AA defences have been proof against each other's airstrikes? In short, no. They wouldn't be immune to each other's airstrikes. And the reason for that is that whilst AA technology had advanced massively and significantly, so had aircraft and weapons technology. So when you think about at the time, the sort of triangle of dive bomber, fighter, and torpedo bomber, what had changed between the beginning of World War I or beginning of World War II, I should say, and the end of World War II when you compare it to US or Royal Navy AA fire? Well, aircraft had gotten tougher, faster, etc. So they took more hits to take down. Now, fair enough, you had lots of 40mm at that point. You still had the Oerlikon 20s. You had VT and proximity fuses. And you had AA guns that were much better at tracking and elevation than they had been at the beginning of the war. But at the same time, you had practices such as what the US Navy had introduced of fighters, which are obviously a lot faster and more agile, going in and strafing enemy anti-aircraft positions, and obviously the 20 and 40mm positions are quite exposed, in order to suppress the AA that the enemy could use. That was used to great effect on Yamato, for example. You also had modifications to airdrop torpedoes. So again, using the US Navy as an example, the Avenger was capable of dropping its torpedo at a lot higher altitude, moving a lot faster, and therefore it was nowhere near as vulnerable as the low and slow approach that they had to take in the early to mid and even some parts of the late war, which obviously that diminishes the effectiveness, especially of light and medium AA. It's one of the reasons why the Oerlikon 20mm was actually pretty much on its way out by the end of World War II, because Britain and America were looking at what they could do and realising that actually the 20mm, which even at the best of times had been a kind of will hit that aircraft that's just dropped its weapon on us to make sure it can't come back weapon, as opposed to shooting the aircraft down before it could drop the weapon, which was what the 40mm and the heavier AA was for. So the 20mm was no longer of all that much utility. It's better to have more 40s, basically. And you had other standoff weapons as well. So various forms of standoff bomb, standoff missile were either under development or in active testing. You had weapons like highball coming in on the Royal Navy side of things. You had skip bombing for the US Navy. And so all of these things were designed to either allow aircraft to penetrate the AA envelope a lot quicker and get out a lot quicker, which reduces the amount of time they're exposed to AA fire, or allowing them to drop their weapons further out, which again reduces their exposure to anti-aircraft fire. You also have early radar jammers, decoys, chaff, etc., which could diminish the effectiveness of radar-directed fire control. You've got the fighter strafing we mentioned earlier. And of course, you also have, well, the Royal Navy had this capability throughout most of World War II, and the US Navy was getting into it with USS Enterprise CV6 towards the end of it. Night attacks. Now, you might think, well, hang on a minute, doesn't everyone have radar at this point? Well, kind of. But there's two things. One is the radar that's mounted on the ship, whilst it can give fire control directions to all the various light AA, nothing that was actually in commission at the end of World War II had radar for every single one of its anti-aircraft positions. So some of them would have either been working off someone else's data or would have been working off of searchlights and or blind fire. So that immediately reduces the effectiveness. Plus, although radar-directed AA gunfire exists, even in the best-case scenario, it's still not a 100% precise thing. There's a reason why people are still looking at down gun sites, even in the late war, to make corrections, because the radar-directed AA will get you definitely in the right ballpark and pretty much on the money for a proximity fuse, but you're still having to make minor corrections manually. So without the ability to do that, because it's pitch dark, you have further problems. So whilst the late war anti-aircraft capabilities would have certainly forced a US or Royal Navy strike group of aircraft to adopt different tactics to the ones they were generally using against someone like the Japanese. They did have those tactics, and it would still have resulted in high casualties, but it wouldn't in and of itself have stopped them. Especially, the other thing is when you consider the sheer numbers, especially of the US Navy. If you can throw hundreds of aircraft at a problem, even if the anti-aircraft weaponry sort of size through them at a rate of knots, there's probably still going to be enough survivors who can at least drop their weapons, which are going to cause you problems. So it definitely helps protect, but without the addition of, obviously, combat air patrol and your own carriers, the AAE capabilities of the ships themselves weren't quite at a point where they could resist incoming air assault completely. I mean, there's a reason why immediately after even the 40mm Bofors got ditched relatively quickly, and things like the radar-guided rapid-fire 3-inch guns and such started to come into focus, as well as early missiles, obviously. And so that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock, with one small exception. You will recall a Drydock or two ago there was a question about who was the odd 17th century person on the ski rump of Prince of Wales, and it turns out there is an answer. So this answer comes courtesy of Dave Collier, power and propulsion engineer, who was actually working on Prince of Wales whilst it was under construction, and therefore was an eyewitness. He says, HMS Prince of Wales was not launched per se, but floated out of the dry dock where we built her. I don't recall anyone in costume or much in the way of any ceremony, as it's a rather slow and difficult process done on a bitterly cold day in late December. I think there was a pipe band in full Highland costume at the naming ceremony, however, when she was still in dry dock. However, based on the question, I don't think this is what was being referred to. I believe he is referring to when the ship left the Firth of Forth and put to sea for the first time. We had a piper by the name of Robbie McIsaac in full Highland costume standing on the front of the ski jump playing the bagpipes as we went under the Forth bridges for the first time. This was done to celebrate both the ship's Scottish birthplace and the connection between Scotland, Scottish shipbuilding, and the Royal Navy. The person who asked the question is right, though, it did look seriously cool. His memory of the ship looming out of the rain and fog, led by a man in full Highland gear, rings true. You do get a lot of foggy and rainy days in Scotland, and this was certainly one of them. Unfortunately, despite being on the ship at the time, I didn't actually get to see it. It was the first time we had been able to run the drives and propulsion motors at anything more than tick-over speed, so I was down in the engine control room monitoring everything and keeping my fingers crossed. Thankfully, everything worked magnificently, and we sailed serenely into the North Sea to begin many weeks of testing. So there we go, mystery solved. We now know who the mysterious 17th century looking figure on the bow of Prince of Wales was. So with that, I don't believe there's any channel admin this week, so thank you very much for listening, and I hope to catch you again in another video.